Hello and welcome to the Geopolitics and Business Briefing, the podcast where we unpack major geopolitical developments and what they mean for global companies, together with the experts who analyze these issues every day. Today, we're looking at a broader shift in US technology controls. The US is increasingly trying to control not only where strategic technology is shipped, but also who ultimately owns and controls and accesses it. Washington made that clear with its last guidance on advanced AI chips and the so-called AI diffusion rule. That matters for companies operating global high-tech supply chains, from cloud and data centers to also electronics, automotive, industrial automation, and many more. So to help us understand what is changing and why it matters, I am joined today by Kevin Allison. You're president and founder of Minerva Technology Futures and located in Washington, D.C. Warm welcome, Kevin. It's a great pleasure to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Kevin, before we get into the nitty-gritty details, could you tell me why have advanced AI chips become such a central issue in US-China technology competition?
Sure. This story goes back now nearly a decade. If you think about what has been happening in the technology sector and in geopolitics over the past 10 years, one of the most important stories has been the emergence of artificial intelligence, and governments, including the US and China, which are the two biggest countries, the most powerful countries in terms of technology and advancing the technology frontier in the world, viewing artificial intelligence as being very important for their future, the future of economic growth, the future of military capabilities, and through the combination of those two things, very important for the geopolitical global situation. How are the U.S. and China, as the world's two leading economies and technological superpowers, going to live with each other in the world beyond this decade into the middle decades of the 21st century? A lot of it will depend on AI, and semiconductors are absolutely essential for AI. And so what you have seen, not just very recently, but over a succession of US presidential administrations, has been the US government reckoning with that idea. I think also as AI technology has developed and concerns about potentially artificial general intelligence, this idea that AI technologies could become very, very capable, better than any humans at doing particular tasks, trying to ensure that each country is the one that gets there first. The US has seen this idea of its dominance of the global semiconductor industry as a potential choke point to try to ensure that US remains in the lead. And so the guidance that you're referring to from the Bureau of Industry and Security, from the Commerce Department on chips, is just the latest instance of this much bigger background story.
Now you mentioned exactly that guidance. What did BIS signal with the May 31st guidance and the AI diffusion rule? What does it mean in general, and what's the real change here now?
Yes. So to go to more recent history, in the very final weeks of the Biden administration, President Biden's White House put out a rule known as the Diffusion rule, which sought to control the flow of the most advanced semiconductors that are very important for developing frontier AI capabilities. It sought to control which countries can get access to these. It was a rather controversial rule, divided the world into three different groups of countries. And as you can imagine, some countries like China, Russia, North Korea, and so on, the rule said they don't get any chips. Other countries, like European countries, NATO allies, were split between a couple of other different buckets of countries that would get varying access to these most advanced semiconductors. When the Trump administration came into office, they very quickly withdrew that Biden rule. This reflected the interests of some people in Silicon Valley who had gone into the administration. There was a really kind of big pivot around this to saying, we don't want to so strictly regulate the flow of American compute overseas. We actually want AI that is built overseas to be built on top of American compute. So there was a rethink. Now, what BIS has done with the May 31st guidance on the AI diffusion rule, which was never formally withdrawn, it was just kind of enforcement was put on hold. They have issued new guidance saying, well, you are going to need licenses. You're going to need to ask permission to be able to export advanced compute to countries where the entity that might be using those chips is owned by a country in this group, the Russia, China, DPRK group of countries. If you are exporting this advanced computing product, you need a license if the end user is based in one of those countries. So that is the new change.
That's an interesting shift from what I've seen. I mean, it's shifting from where does the chip go to who in the end owns and controls it and has access to it. Would you say there is a shift in general in export control logic we can see here?
Well, I think that export controls always have been a kind of blunt instrument. They also have, to an extent, been organized geographically. So where are the chips going as a proxy for saying who are the end users, right? And end user has always been a key element, not only end user, but what the end use is. So the logic is not necessarily new. I think also we've seen in previous US administrations this idea of if, for instance, a chip is going to, let's just, by way of example, just sort of picking the name of a country out of a hat, if it's going to Singapore, or if it's going to a Gulf country, a country in the Persian Gulf, it doesn't just matter where it's going, but who might be using it at the end of the day, right? So that's how you can think about this new rule working. There was an effort in the Biden administration also to cover another loophole that remains open, which is the idea that even if that chip is going in another country to a data center that is built or even operated by a US or other trusted company, could end users from this problematic group of countries in the eyes of the US government, could those end users still gain access through cloud services? So I would view the new BIS guidance as an important signal of where things are going, but it's by no means the end of the story.
And in general, what would you say? What is Washington trying to achieve with this move? Who's the US trying to constrain, and why does it think this lever works?
I think there are multiple objectives. First, and it's been stated very clearly from the first day of the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, this idea of ensuring that the new infrastructure that is built that will eventually run the new economy that operates on AI will be controlled or influenced, or in the words of the administration, dominated by American firms. So American AI dominance is probably one objective of Washington. Across administrations, the U.S. has also sought to make sure that U.S. technology and U.S. Technology advantages are not used by what the White House and others call U.S. adversaries. So they want to make sure that China, both for national security reasons and for economic reasons, that its leading tech companies maybe don't have access to the most advanced US chips. Of course, the complication is that over years now of having these types of controls in place, think about going back several years to the Biden administration's efforts to restrict China's access to the most advanced AI chips directly. China has, in spite of that constraint, and in spite of the US trying to use that choke point, it has continued to gain ground technologically. You have very innovative Chinese companies, both at the hardware level, companies like Huawei with its Ascend series of semiconductors. You also have Chinese AI labs, like the lab that makes DeepSeek, that in spite of multiple US export control efforts have managed to make progress. I think the other interesting thing to look at here in terms of how the reality matches up to Washington's objectives Export controls are again, they're a blunt instrument. They are not a perfect tool. They may restrict access to cutting edge US chips, but they also have a tendency, and we've seen this happening with China, to force domestic players in that country to work more closely together and to get the government to spend more resources on indigenizing technological capabilities. They also create geopolitical friction. So we're at a very interesting moment in US-China relations where we've had a period of time where the US and China had reached a relatively fragile understanding amid the tariffs and other things that the Trump administration was pursuing last year. We're now heading into late October, where the trade truce that was agreed effectively in Busan in Korea in November of last year will be expiring. And so you've seen this move by BIS, but other moves across the kind of US system, including things like the Match Act, which was recently put in Congress. This is another example. This is coming from Congress, not from the White House, but the Match Act is a congressional bill that is trying to prevent Huawei from being able to produce chips at scale. Right. So you've got BIS guidance, you've got the Match Act and other issues going on, including from the Pentagon, for example, a big expansion of one of the Pentagon lists to include companies like Alibaba, Baidu, BYD, and others, which China might see as provocative in the context of this US-China trade truce. So I think Washington does have a pretty clear objective, but I think there is also a lot of questions about how the pursuit of that objective fits into broader US-China relations and geopolitical strategy.
Interesting. Now, I think we've always seen kind of a tit for tat game in US-China relations. How do you expect Beijing to respond? I mean, politically, also commercially, or through its own regulatory tools? And do you see any second order effects that companies should watch for?
Well, I think to understand what's going on here, it's useful to step back and look again at what is ultimately the issue here. The issue is the US-China competition over AI. And if you think about AI, there's a whole stack of technologies that make AI work. This is something that at Minerva we talk about all the time. AI is not just the AI models and it's not just the AI applications. It's all of the hardware and software underneath that. It's cloud infrastructure, increasingly also edge infrastructure, telecommunications networks, endpoint devices like PCs, laptops, and phones. It's also underneath that the semiconductors, but also the data, and increasingly even things like critical minerals and energy, which are important for making AI happen at a large scale across economies. And what has happened, again, over the past decade or so, the United States seeing China increasingly as an adversary geopolitically, rather than primarily as an attractive destination or growth market for US companies. The US has put in place at every single layer of that stack, from the AI models all the way down to critical minerals and energy, it's put in place a series of policy levers. Well, China has also put in place its own corresponding policy levers. They have seriously expanded the economic and technology statecraft toolkit that they are able to use. And now what you face in world politics is a situation where, at a time when geopolitics is very disrupted, long-standing security issues are very disrupted, and trade is very disruptive, you have Washington in one corner and Beijing in the other corner pulling these policy levers in geopolitical competition with each other. So in Beijing, what has this meant? It has meant that the Chinese government has pushed through a series of supply chain rules and export restrictions that in many ways really very much mirror some of the US restrictions that have been placed on China over successive presidential administrations. So China now has policy tools that could allow it to look at where are critical minerals or rare earth magnets, for example, headed? Which specific end users, kind of borrowing from the US export control dictionary, China is looking at which end users and which end uses are receiving these materials, these critical materials from China. And China now has an ability from a policy standpoint to deny export licenses that might be important for US production. We've seen this dynamic playing out multiple times over the course of 2025 before that Busan meeting where the US and China were able to agree this kind of fragile détente. So how could Beijing respond? I think depending on how the discussions between the US and China go in the wake of the meeting between President Xi and President Trump that just took place this spring, we'll see. But China certainly has policy tools that it has shown that it can use to have some pretty significant effects on the availability of some of these components, particularly further down in the stack, like in critical minerals and rare earth magnets, that, by the way, are really important for AI. They're important for AI data centers, for instance, but they're also important for renewable energy and automobiles and many other industrial applications. So I think that is the dynamic to closely watch right now. I think that companies should be watching out not only for what the US is doing on China, but what we call the two-way policy risk. How is China responding with its own policy toolkit? And then what does that mean? Not just for like geopolitics and the stock market, but for very specific supply chains that companies need to be concerned about. And I think that is the urgent issue facing chief executives and boards and also procurement and government affairs shops today, is that you need to understand in detail how this two countries pulling policy levers in geopolitical competition with one another could affect your ability to make the product that you sell or your ability to access the technology that makes your business run.
And that goes far beyond companies selling chips. Right, that applies to to many industries. Yeah,
that's right, and that dependency will only increase over time. Like my shorthand way of saying this is that any company of global size has a problem with this. They have a challenge that they face in understanding how their supply chain depends on these technologies that have become the focal point of geopolitical competition between the US and China. Still, and I'd say the tech sector is most advanced at looking this, particularly semiconductors, because they have a very sophisticated understanding of their supply chains. But companies all up and down the technology stack, but also the companies that depend on that technology to make money, they really have an urgent need to understand this issue. It is an urgent matter for any company of global significance.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for breaking this down for us and putting it into the broader context, helping me and also the listeners, of course, to understand so much better what is going on. To our listeners, if you would like to explore this topic further, you can find more analysis on it on Geolytics Hub. You will find the link in the description. And if you have any feedback or suggestions for topics you want us to cover, feel free to reach out at podcast@geo-lytics.com. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time in the Geopolitics and Business Briefing room. Thanks and bye.
Bye.